Hello, and you're welcome back to this week's Unfiltered Autistic Podcast. This week, you'll only be joined by myself, Amanda McGuinness. Truth be told, I ran out of time and didn't have time to edit the podcast I'd planned for this week. So that is the truth. I like to be unfiltered and have no veil and tell you that I ran out of time. So that is the truth. So that's what you're hearing from me this week. I'm short on time today because it is my gorgeous cousins Jack and Max's nativity, or a nativity-based activity that's occurring today. So I am going to be, presenting on a shorter podcast today. The focus of today's podcast is the day of diagnosis. So this is a question that comes into me quite often through Little Puddin social media on Facebook or Instagram, or in my personal life, where different families I know now are realising or finding out that they have children that are autistic and they've gone forward for assessments, or they've been through the assessment, they now have the report, and they just want to, as I always say, have a safe place to land, have someone that they can ask a question of, or what does this mean in the report, or what does this mean now or for into the future. So I think it's really great to always have, I think one of my friends said to me recently that it's a comfort for them to know that I'm there, because we're going to meet in the near future just to discuss their own Little Puddin's diagnostic report. And I said, I'm there if you need me, just shoot me a text, you know where the house is, come on over and we'll have a cup of tea and talk it through. And I think that's what I hope in some which way I can be for people like myself, for parents or autistic people that have gone through the assessment. I know I was very lucky. After I was identified as an adult, I had a very strong knowledge base on autism. I really understood autism. It still is inverted commas a thing that when you are identified as autistic, or when you have a child that's identified as autistic, it is important to have somebody that you can reach out to or talk to. I was very lucky in that I could reach out to a friend on social media. I could chat to her about it. She was absolutely incredible. She's an incredible human being to this day. It was great to have her perspective and talk it through. She was also an autistic person who has a wealth of knowledge in this area and expertise as well, a professional that works in this area. But it was a privilege to be able to talk to somebody. And I often think, isn't it a privilege for myself to have a podcast, to have wonderful listeners like yourself to take the time to listen, that it is important that I use that platform for good. So again, as I said to my friend this week just gone by, I'm here whenever you need me. And I suppose that's the point of the podcast. I think from the lens then of today's topic of the day of diagnosis, the diagnosis really isn't a word I naturally use. I usually say identified. So my person's been identified. And the reason that I might say that instead of diagnosis is because my brain has always been my brain. I was born with the brain that I have. Therefore, my autistic brain didn't arrive somewhere along the way. It has always been within my rather large head. So therefore, I've always been autistic. So I suppose what I'll often say to parents is that I'll reflect back on my own experience. And obviously I have 4 neurodivergent children. They've all had different types of assessments over the years. My 3 autistic sons, I suppose Connor's assessment came through a hospital, I suppose very dramatic hospital visit. That's in podcast 1 if you want to listen to that, how that all came to be. And then my gorgeous Jack, and then later my beautiful Max. And when I think about the day of diagnosis or the day of identification, I really probably will focus more on Max more than any of them, because I suppose Connor's came out of the blue. It didn't. I should have maybe known, but I didn't know anything about autism when Connor was identified. But I clearly knew that there was real struggles and challenges there, real positive differences as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have brought him to Mayo General that day. But I did know that he was different. And I think for any parent that's bringing a child for an assessment, if you're listening as a parent or as an autistic person, you might agree potentially that yes, I did have feelings that perhaps my child was a little bit different, or maybe in a childcare setting, or in a school or primary, maybe a secondary, maybe in a college setting, someone has pointed out to you that your child is different, or if you're an adult, maybe has pointed out to you that perhaps it might be worth your while going for an assessment and wondering if you might just be autistic. Not just, but you might be autistic. So I suppose from that lens then I'm going to assume that everyone listening is maybe querying, could their child be autistic, or their child is autistic, or maybe they're professional listening and wondering what is that lived experience lens like for a parent. What I can tell you it really is like is that it is like you're between two worlds. You need to have that information for your child, but you also don't want to have that information for your child, not because you don't want to know your child better than you ever did before now, and not because you don't want to understand that your child is autistic. It's because you do know, because like all of us are on social media, we watch television programs where unfortunately and really unkindly people that are different are often displayed in a really negative light, or often it's the person that is very clearly different that is we say the villain of the piece, or the person that's to be mocked in the piece if it's a media representation. Not always, but often. I think it's changing changing, but there's obviously, as always, a lot more work to be done. If you're anybody that's ever used social media, I'm sure that unfortunately at least once in your life you might have seen something online that's very negative, talking about autism or a disability or difference. In your real life context, maybe you work with people that are different, and maybe you're really neuroaffirmative, but maybe other people aren't. Or maybe in your daily life you live in a place where there are people that are different, and maybe you're really neuroaffirmative, but maybe other people aren't. The way that they maybe discuss, talk about, support or not support that person. So I can understand, and maybe it's useful for professionals to understand, that when you are having parents that are coming into you for assessments, first of all, those parents are loaded with experiences, positive or negative, about their child. And I don't mean their view of their child. I mean, they've had experiences in the world with their children where other people have been highly negative, either about their child, towards their child, or excluded their child. If it's an autistic person themselves, a teen, an adult, a young adult, they've also had those experiences, and they have had that lived lifelong experience if they're being identified later in life, where through no fault of the family, but perhaps they've gone forward for an assessment, not been identified, and now here they are today in front of you as an adult, looking to be identified, perhaps finally for the first time in their lives, being seen for who they are, if that makes sense. So I suppose be very, very aware as the clinician or as the therapeutic individual, that the parents in front of you, even the autistic person, young or old in front of you, that they have had a loaded experience up until this point when they're now in front of you. And to be very, I suppose, careful and cautious with your words, because as my lovely dad would always have said to us growing up, be careful with your words. You can never really know how they may fall upon a person, and they carry them with them for the rest of their lives. And that has been my own experience as, I suppose, as a human being, but more particularly as an autistic person. So I suppose when I think about the day of diagnosis, what I really mean by that is you've now gone through the assessment. You're now being told, perhaps depending on where you live in the world, I know in the west of Ireland it would be common practice that you might, especially in Mayo, that you might meet with the psychologist that has identified your child with a multidisciplinary team as autistic, and now you're being called in to receive that report, and you can talk through that report and they'll explain the report, which is really, really helpful. I think when I think back to my beautiful Max, he would have been identified in the Safari Club in Castlebar. He had a lovely psychologist, really neuroaffirmative, SLT. Unfortunately, there wasn't OT available. I don't believe, I think we had physio at that time. But again, through his multidisciplinary team, he would have been identified as autistic. And I went in that day. My husband would have been at home with, as I call them, the gorgeous puddings. They would have been a lot younger then as well. Max would have been identified just after he was 1. Again, not really heard of as, maybe it's more common now, wouldn't have been as common then. So he's 7 now. So 6 years ago, he would have been identified it was very early in his, as I do say, in his 1-year-old year. I'm going to grab a mouthful of tea, apologies. I was on a podcast earlier recording, so I'm definitely a bit dry. So I need to have a quick cup of tea. So I'll go on. So when I went in for Max that day, he'd already been through the assessment. It was very clear to me, I think at 3 months old, I was definitely saying to everyone that would listen to me that he was autistic. And they were like, yes, of course, yes. Like, I don't know if they believe me or not, but I was like, this child is autistic. And he was. So I went for the assessment. I was fully aware, because I've been through the process multiple times now, what was going to occur. I knew that the psychologist would talk to me about the report. I knew that the language within the report may identify the differences that my son has, but it would, unfortunately, because it is a medicalized instrument, it would identify them, unfortunately, or did in those days, in a very pathologized, medicalized way. So it would say, language like deficits or cannot, is not able to X, Y, and Z. I understood that, but I also understood as an experienced parent that report, although was a snapshot in time of my beautiful Max during that assessment process and the information that obviously family and myself had given as well, that ultimately that wasn't the only reflection of my lovely Max. And the language that are used, or it has been used in the past in medicalized reports, in my personal opinion, wouldn't be a reflection of my beautiful Max. It was just the language that had to be used, or was being used. Maybe it didn't have to be ever, but was at that time being used. Wouldn't be the neuroaffirmative language that I hope is being used more progressively these days. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that was the language. And I remember going in and saying to myself, do not cry, just sit down there and listen to it was a lady psychologist, listen to the lady, take in that information, and then you're going to go to O'Brien's Cafe. And you'd be like, how does O'Brien's Cafe have anything to do with your son's autism assessment? But what I had to do with it was that I was saying to myself, you will not cry. You will go into the assessment and then you're going to somewhere very public where you will not cry. And I thought, well, I'll go down to O'Brien's, because that was in Castlebar at the time, was a very busy place to go. So we went through the assessment the assessment discussing the report with the psychologist, or I say we, I mean I went through that with the psychologist, talked it all through with her. She answered any questions that I had, very helpful, all of that. And then I just said, thank you very much, took the piece of paper in the envelope, and off we went. And it was in my rather large, for no particular reason, handbag that I always seem to have. And I went into O'Brien's and I sat down, and I already knew before I went in what I was going to do. I was just going to sit there. I wouldn't be able to do anything. And it wasn't because my son was being diagnosed as autistic or being identified as autistic. It was because I knew, just as I knew when I walked into the room that day, that I'd already had a loaded experience all throughout Max's young life so far of people treating him differently, talking about him differently, even to the fact I believe I was on I believe I was actually. I know I was there. I was like, was I there? I was. I was on the Late Late Show a number of years ago talking to Ryan Tuberty at the time and telling him that, you know, and it was true and is true that when I was pregnant with Max, people would often say to me, oh, you're so brave. And I would say, for what? And they were like, for having another one. And I would say, having another human being. They were like, no, having another child that could have the autism. And I would say, okay. And like you hear it once or twice, you're like, God, that was strange. And then after a while you go, I don't want to leave the house anymore. And eventually I stopped leaving the house when I was pregnant with Max because I couldn't take another person speaking so negatively, in my view, of a brand new unborn child that was yet to be born that I loved so much and counted the kicks of every day. And that little boy that kept me awake when he would move around in my belly at nighttime, that this is the way other people were viewing that he was going to be some type of potential blight on society. And I remember just being like, oh my God, I cannot do this anymore. Because again, I was overwhelmed, pregnant, had multiple other children at home. But I laugh about it, but it wasn't a laughing matter at the time. So when I walked into that appointment that day with the psychologist, I didn't just walk in to get information about a report. I walked in with, in my context, a years long experience already of people treating my son that was very visibly now different because he was stimming, he was tiptoe walking, he was looking out through his beautiful peripheral vision, he was lining up his toys. He was very clearly autistic, even as a very young child. So there's people commenting already very negatively, unfortunately. Not people in my family context or people that I would know very well, but people, I suppose, external to the family would say really unkind things. And again, they weren't intentionally unkind. It was kind of throwaway remarks. But again, I will always say, really consider what you're saying and where it's landing and how it's landing upon the person, because we don't know anyone's lived experience. So just to be always careful and kind with our words. And again, I'm no saint. I'm sure I get things wrong through blunder 99% of the time, and I don't intend to. And when I do reflect back on it, I go, oh my God, why did I say that? And then I'll go back and try and correct if there's an avenue, and if there's not, I'll go, well, lesson learned there, Amanda, don't ever say that again. And then live in my mind forever to never say the thing I said bluntly by accident or whatever. So it's not that people were going out of their way to say unkind things to pregnant ladies. It was more that that's just how people view, but it was insight, I suppose, as to how people viewed my being pregnant, having already 2 identified autistic children. I suppose then when I was in the O'Brien's coffee shop that day, again, I knew I wasn't going to eat the sandwich that I ordered. I wasn't going to drink the tea. I was just going to sit there and let it settle upon me that now, not only was I battling for my beautiful Connor, I was now battling society for my beautiful Jack. And I was saying to myself, can I do this a third time? As in, can I battle? And I was saying to myself, as I'm sure I just sat there like a rock in the middle of the cafe, I said to myself, you can do this, Amanda. And I would say to any parents listening, you can do this. This is your beautiful child. No matter their age, no matter what it says in the report, this is your beautiful child, and your beautiful child that you wanted. And this is your beautiful child that was born, and your beautiful child that I always say that I kissed and hugged that first night they were born here on earth. As in my own children, not yours. So when I say that, I mean that when each of my children were born, I would do the same thing. That's me being very autistic. Do the same thing. I would kiss them from top to bottom, toes, fingers, little chubby cheeks in their face, and their beautiful little nose. I would do that when I would promise them that I would look after them and I do everything that I can for them. And if I didn't get it right, sometimes I would apologize, but that anytime I would get it right, I would try my best to never get it wrong again. And I would always do my best if I could at all for them. And I would always make that promises to each of my beautiful children when they were born. And I'm sure, as many parents do, I get it wrong, I'm sure 80% of the time, but the 20% that I do get right, I do my absolute best to try and get it right again and again afterwards. And I think when I sat down that day, I was doubting myself. Did I have the energy this time? Could I do it this time? Could I learn? Because as I also know, and I knew then, every autistic person is different. And I know that's my lived experience in my household. It's my lived experience as a professional supporting families. And I remember worrying, saying, will I know enough? Can I learn enough? When will I, what if Max needs help with this? And what if and then I remember saying, well, didn't you get through everything with Connor? Didn't you learn as much as you could for Connor? And I said, yes. And didn't you learn everything you could learn for Jack? Yes. Aren't you still learning for Connor? Aren't you still learning for Jack? And I was saying to myself, yes. And I was saying, and won't you do the same for Max? And in my head, I was saying, yes. And then I was saying, and if Max communicates differently, which he does, he's a Gestalt language processor, I was saying to myself, won't you learn everything about that? And I was like, yes. And then I was saying, so what are you afraid of? And I was saying to myself, I'm afraid of people being unkind to Max. I'm not afraid of Max, and I'm not afraid of Max being autistic, but I'm afraid of people being unkind. And then I said to myself, but didn't you get through all of that before? And I said, yes. So I said, so far, Amanda, and again, I self-talk all the time. I said to myself in my brain, I said, well, so far, it seems to me that you've been able to get through every single part of this whole life, a journey that you've been on with your gorgeous puddings. And it seems to me that you will get through the next stage, because that's what you're here to do. You're here to guide your gorgeous children. So if you're a parent, you're here to guide your beautiful puddings, as I would call them. You're here to read that report, to understand the report as best you can, but to know that this is only stage one, that you now just have a report that gives you an insight clinically to how your child is being viewed. That is not saying that your child won't grow and develop. I can tell you that the report I read on day one of Max's diagnosis day to the Max Golden, who only last week pulled down the curtain pole, I'm not joking, in the living room doing a somersault over the side of the, don't even ask me, over a therapy ball into the back of the couch, and then caught his leg in the curtain pole and pulled it down and nearly broke the couch as well when it fell, but again landed somehow energetically back onto the therapy ball. He did like a back flip back. I don't even know how he did it. That this is not the same boy that I read the report of that day, because in all those years since, I've been by his side. I've been very lucky to know so many incredible colleagues and professionals along the way that have been able to give me support. He's working with the incredible Teresa Foley, specialist feeding therapist for his ARFID. I link in all the time with the incredible Julie Holmes, a speech and language therapist around Gestalt. I have so many wonderful friends that I could ask a question of. I have so many wonderful colleagues in his school where he goes to. That the little boy that was captured in the report clinically for the purposes only of that diagnostic criteria for autism. So remember, that lens views him in that report in a very specific way to meet the criteria. Does he meet that criteria for clinically through that medicalized lens of autism? Did he meet that criteria? He did. But is the little boy that I read on that page one of that report the same boy that's in front of me today, or breaking my curtains and curtain poles? No, he's not. He does have those differences that he had then, but I framed them through the neurodiversity paradigm, through the neuroaffirming lens of he has communication differences, social imagination, social interaction differences. He has an autistic brain. He also has ARFID. He has lots of differences, sensory differences. But they're not negatives. They give me a lens through which to understand him. And if I can understand him through that lens, then the Amanda McGuinness that sat in the O'Brien's coffee shop all those years ago doubting could she do it again, I can tell you, third child diagnosed, I did do it again. And I'm not saying I'm perfect, I'm far from it. But what I do try to do is I try to get up every day, and I try every single day to understand my gorgeous Max, my gorgeous Connor, my beautiful Jack, my beautiful Hayley. And every single day I try to do the best that I can for them. And some days I get it so dramatically wrong. I definitely wouldn't put it on an Insta story, but I get it wrong. And I'm sure I could get it wrong over the Christmas, and I'm sure I could get it wrong at any other time in their lives. But the point is, I get up again the next day and I try again. And I try and learn as much as I can for them, and I try and support them as much as I can. So if you feel you're about going to get that report, or maybe you have that report and you're reading that report, maybe it frightens you because there's lots of language that you mightn't understand, or maybe you've never read before. Can I just tell you that in a year from now, you will read that report again with a much more educated eye. You will read that report with a much more lived experienced eye, that now you're understanding. You're now going to know more about autism than you ever knew. You suddenly might find yourself as a mini expert yourself. You're going to start to learn so much more about your child, if that makes sense. So just like I did once, you might find yourself doubting yourself now, and doubting, are you the parent that your child needs to be? You are. Will you have the capacity to support your child? You will. Will you learn it all in a moment? You won't. Will it be a lifelong journey of learning for you and your child? It will. Will a day come where you feel like you are in control, and you do know what's happening, and you do know what's best for your child, and you do know everything that there is to be known for your child? That might come. It might be a learning journey. I can tell you, as somebody that's learning all the time, and as my children grow and develop, all of the needs that they have might change a little bit as well. So Jack, for example, he's at the age now where I'm sure he's definitely going into puberty. Max is at that age of 7, 8, 9 where he's losing teeth, and that's bothering him a little bit. And my beautiful Connor is almost 15. He's growing into a very handsome, I would say, young, incredible young man. The point is, my knowledge base grows as they grow. They have provided me with not only so much love and support as children to their mom, but also from the avenue of learning about autism. I have learned so much from each of my sons, and you will learn so much from your child. So what I would say to you, I suppose, towards the end of this podcast is, if you're worrying, that's okay to worry. Will you always feel so worried? You might feel a little bit worried, but will you eventually grow in confidence in your own knowledge base and how you're understanding autism? I guarantee you that you will. I guarantee it, and I guarantee very few things, but I guarantee you that your knowledge base on autism will grow and develop just as your beautiful child will grow and develop. The report, again, as I said earlier, is a snapshot in time. It's not the absolute focus of how your child will always be. It's a snapshot in time through that clinical criteria where they're assessing your child to meet that standard within that clinical framework. Say, for example, if it is through the DSM-5, there's a reason that they've used the language that they have. They're trying to meet that criteria. I would hope, depending on where you live in the country or how neuroaffirmative it is, the practice that you've been able to access, that the way within which they've written or typed up that report, it is neuroaffirmative. It may not be. I understand that. But just remember this, you know your child better than anyone, and that this report is just a snapshot in time. This diagnosis is just a snapshot in time. Your child will grow and develop. Your knowledge base will grow and develop. And if you're feeling a little bit out of your depth right now, or if you're feeling a little bit like, I'm not sure if I can, I promise you that one day you won't always feel like this. And one day you will have that information that you need. And one day you will be everything that you've ever wanted to be for your child. But give yourself time to grow and develop as well. You're on a new journey now with your, as I call them, your gorgeous pudding. Your gorgeous pudding is on a new journey now, because now they are going to have people in their lives that really understand them through a new lens. And now you're all going to go off on this learning journey together. And you're going to celebrate not only the big successes, but the small successes, because now you're going to really understand the value of not only humanity, but the value of really looking at what is life really all about. I often say that about Connor, that I look around and I say, God, if it wasn't for Connor, I never would have lifted or would have been able or tuned to lift that veil upon the world and to really see what living life and loving life was all about. So I hope this podcast this week has been helpful. If you need me, I'm there on social media. As I said to my friend last week, I'm here if you need me, and she told me it was a comfort. I'm glad it's a comfort. So I'm here if you need me. Message me anytime through my social media. Again, as I said earlier, I'm on I think Instagram, Facebook. I'm not sure wherever else I am here on the podcast. I have websites there as well, littlepudden.ie and amandamcguinness.com. So if you ever need me, I'm there. There's bound to be a contact tab on something where you can send me a message, even if it's just for a quick reply of reassurance. You'll be able to find me there. But listen, I'll go now because it is my gorgeous puddings like an activity or nativity activity. That's a lot of activities for me to try and say together with my Mayo accent. But I'll go now because I need to dash off to be with my gorgeous puddings. But thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Next week, I will definitely be chatting away to a guest who I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear from as well, as was I when I was chatting to her. So thank you very much. Have a lovely week, and coming up to Christmas, can't believe it. So I'll go. Thank you. Thanks for listening, and I'll chat to you again next week. Bye bye.